The opportunity for a bit of a dialogue. By the way, just an informal, random. How many think we ought to have early voting in Virginia without excuse? There you go. Good. Make sure your delegates and senators know that in Richmond. Okay. So, our first panelist, Tanya Clay House. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And good morning to everybody. It's really a pleasure to see everyone here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am myself a Virginianite. I live in Fairfax County, up in Springfield, so it was nice to not have to go into D.C. Today. Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And no traffic, right?
No traffic, going against the traffic. I was loving that. Thank you so much for allowing me to submit these remarks on behalf of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We really appreciate this opportunity to provide the statement on our critical issue of electoral reform. And once again, my name's Tanya Clay House. I am the Director of Public Policy at the Lawyers Committee. We were founded back in 1963 by President John F. Kennedy. And we have a mission to engage the private bar in order to eliminate racial discrimination, particularly against communities of color, and to protect our nation's civil rights laws. In that regard, we are actively involved in trying to protect the right to vote, ensure the integrity of our elections through litigation and policy advocacy. So the 2012 election demonstrated to us that many Americans are willing to overcome problems with the election administration in order to participate in their civic duty to vote. But they shouldn't have to. It also showed us that election officials have a lot more work to do in order to ensure that eligible voters are able to cast a ballot and that voters are not subject to unnecessary or malicious barriers to the ballot. So as part of our voting and election administration work, the Lawyers Committee leads the election protection effort, which everyone here is a part of. We actually the Election Protection Coalition comprises over 100 organizations across the country, both federal and state. And it also, a major component of this is to work to, as I said, ensure the democracy for all eligible Americans. Now, a major component of this program is our hotline. We have a 1-866 Our Vote hotline, which hopefully many of you were aware of. We received calls through that hotline as well as two other hotlines working through the Latino community, 1-888-VEI-VOTA, and also the Asian American community, 888-API-VOTE. Now, through these hotlines, they were manned by thousands of volunteers across the country, both legal and grassroots efforts we put together for this election protection effort, and this allowed us to have a comprehensive support structure in place on Election Day. Just for your information, we have been doing this since the 2000 elections, since that debacle that we all are quite familiar with. Now, during the 2012 election, we received over 170,000 calls. And this is from voters who were seeking, just information and assistance. So, as a supplement to the testimony that I believe my colleague Dara Lindenbaum, so she has our testimony and she'll make sure that that's put in the back. But as a supplement to our testimony, we also prepared a preliminary report, which you can access on our website at www.lawyerscommittee.org. And so it's very simple. It'll be right there on the flash page. Don't worry, I checked to make sure it was there with my staff, so we don't have problems with that. But it is it's a preliminary report that gives you an overview. And so we will be releasing a final report at the end of this month so that you can actually see what happened across the nation with all of these calls that we received throughout the country. As we prepared for the 2012 elections, we had to incorporate a coordinated campaign to counter the spate of repressive voter laws that I think we've already heard about that were passed in the preceding year. Now, these efforts did result in at least 5 governors, both in governors in Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, North Carolina, and New Hampshire, vetoing restrictive voter ID laws. Now, furthermore, although South Carolina was required their voter ID law was pre-cleared, they were required to substantially modify that ID law, and it didn't permit its use during the 2012 election. Similarly, Wisconsin's ID law was blocked in 2012, as well as Pennsylvania. Now, despite these victories, the hotline still received a large amount of calls related to the confusion and misinformation regarding voter ID requirements. And so our preliminary data suggests that this resulted in an increase of calls to the hotline over the past 2 federal elections. Now, as documented also in our preliminary findings, voter registration and polling place problems counted for over 40% of the calls that we received to the hotline. Now, mistakes by election officials using what we call a very antiquated voter registration system, often led to these long lines that we've heard about, as well as the confusion and the overuse and misuse of provisional ballots, and ultimately, and unfortunately, the disenfranchisement of many Americans who were trying to exercise their right to vote. Now, in addition to registration problems, voters also experienced confusion and disenfranchisement at the polling place on Election Day. And much of this chaos and the wait times we also attribute to the result of not only poor organization and management, but particularly in some of the polling places, such as inadequate signage and supervision to direct voters to the correct line. For example, we saw in Detroit, for instance, many voters were reporting that they were extremely frustrated at the prospect of waiting in 2-hour lines. I know we had 5-hour lines here in Virginia, so that seems nice, but in 2-hour lines, but they were waiting these 2-hour lines with no knowledge of whether or not they were standing even in the correct line. Because in Detroit, you had multiple precincts within one polling place. And so the poll workers were not telling people which line they were supposed to be in. And so when they got to the front of the line, they were told they had to go to the back of the line in the other lane. I know my time's up, I'm sure, so I'm going to end very quickly. So we believe that there could be a need for additional poll worker training in order to eliminate some of this voter confusion, as well as make sure that we have more adequate resources. Briefly before I end, I want to mention that I mentioned the deceptive practices and voter intimidation that occurred across the country. There were a lot of robocalls and improper signage that was put up. We did have the robocalls here in Virginia as well as in Florida, and the Election Protection Coalition did do a lot of work in order to actually correct the information that was given out in these wrong and these bad robocalls, as well as we had billboards that were put up in places in Ohio and Wisconsin telling people that voter fraud is a felony, up to 3.5 years and a $10,000 fine. And they particularly put in African American communities and Latino communities, really trying to curb and chill the ability of these people to go to the polling place. So as we move forward, and I know my colleagues here are really going to talk about moving forward in this election, how it is that we can counter these problems that I've already discussed kind of at a national level. We really encourage there to be a robust discussion about voter registration, modernization, as well as eliminating deceptive practices, getting rid of these voter caging efforts that are really disenfranchising voters, and expanding early voting, as well as increasing poll worker training. So thank you again for this opportunity to present this today.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and your work is so important. For example, as we've watched actually the president's margin grow from Election Day because all those provisional ballots are being counted, your work is so important because we want every vote to be counted that was cast, and we also want to make it easier for people to cast their franchise. Mr. Epstein.
Thank you, Representative Connolly and Representative Cummings. In addition to working at your former employer, I'm also one of your constituents, so it's a pleasure to see you.
God bless you. What a wonderful human being.
Thank you for inviting me. We know there were long lines on Election Day, but what we don't know, surprisingly, is why. There were 2 main places where we get lines in the voting process, at voter sign-in and in the actual voting process. As a scientist, it's important to understand where the problem is before we try to come to a solution. In 2012, as we heard, there are many changes in voter sign-in compared to prior elections, including changes in election laws, increased turnout, the continuing transition to electronic poll books. But there have been no studies looking at how these changes affect the sign-in time. As one of the members of the previous panel noted, they're just gathering the data now. It would have been nice to have that data before we invested in those. We need, but we don't have the scientific measures of the time required for check-in with traditional paper poll books compared to EPBs, including examining the confounding factors such as the level of poll worker training, voter ID laws, and ethnic variations in names. The results of such measurements can help us guide towards improved training and reconfigured staffing in polling places. Once the voter is at the voting booth, the time to vote is influenced by many factors. In Virginia, several people mentioned, there were 2 constitutional amendments and bond issues as well in some places, and many voters were unaware of this. The choice of technology, though, makes a huge, huge difference. In a relatively simple ballot like we have in Virginia, a DRE, a touchscreen voting machine, can realistically handle 150 to 200 voters per day. The maximum number, as several people commented, in Virginia is 750. It's 200 in Maryland. It's 250 in D.C. But even 200 to 250 isn't really workable in most cases. Even with a simple ballot and with the complex ballots that we have in many parts of the country, it's not even close. 100 per DRE is all you can handle. By contrast, when we use paper ballots and ballot scanners, the scanner is the limiting factor, and the scanner can handle a ballot about every 15 seconds or about 3,000 voters a day. So on the one hand, we can buy these DREs, which cost about $5,000 each, and can handle 100 to 200 voters a day, or we can buy an optical scanner, which can handle about 3,000 voters a day for the same cost. Given the budget constraints, I don't have to tell you which one I think is the better idea. The problem isn't a lack of equipment. The problem is not using the right equipment. This is consistent also with anecdotal evidence across the country, with the exception of Florida, where the paper ballot was several pages long. Localities and states with paper ballots and ballot scanners had much shorter lines than those with DREs. As several on the previous panel noted, in Fairfax County, where precincts had both paper and electronic, in those precincts where poll workers encouraged voters to use paper, there were much shorter lines than the precincts where voters were encouraged to use the touchscreen DREs. Having paper ballots is not enough, though. Ballot scanning machines, just like the DREs, do make mistakes. We need scientifically valid post-election audits by manually comparing a small set of the paper ballots to machine-calculated totals to make sure the results are right, just like we do with corporate financial audits. Even if we don't suspect fraud, we still do corporate financial audits. In most states, post-election audits are not performed on a regular basis, but in one state, Virginia, audits are actually illegal in any case that would be useful. National standards for auditing can help ensure that the election results are accurate. Unfortunately for those jurisdictions, using the touchscreen machines, meaningful audits are impossible. We just have to hope they came up with the right answers. Finally, I want to mention internet voting because several prior panelists have done that. There is no clear evidence that internet voting increases turnout, to everybody's surprise. But we know it does substantially increase risk. We know that nation-states, criminals, and hacktivists have broken into military, government, and corporate websites on a routine basis. There's no reason to believe that internet voting sites can be made more secure than banks, e-commerce, or government sites. The vast majority of computer scientists, including nearly all computer security experts, are of the opinion that internet voting cannot be done securely at this time, and probably not for another decade or more. Just as we rely on doctors for our expert medical advice and lawyers for our expert legal advice, we need to rely on computer security experts for advice on the security of internet voting. To summarize, long lines at the polls are caused by a combination of long check-in lines and or long lines at the voting machines. We need to measure the time for the check-in using different technologies and potentially change the processes. Using the ballot scanners are both cheaper and faster than the touch screens, less likely to result in long lines, thus reducing the hurdles to voting, which you mentioned, Congressman, and saving money and saving everybody's time. Fourth, post-election auditing of ballot scanner results is not done on a routine basis in most states, but should be. And fifth, internet voting is far from being ready for use if we care about the accuracy of our elections. And finally, I'll mention here in Virginia, there is a proposal, since several people mentioned the cost of buying new machines as being one of the factors. There is a proposal in front of the legislature to allocate, I believe it's $10 million in state funds that would match county and city funds for buying new optical scan machines. This is a proposal. This has not been voted on, but I'm hoping that will help.
Thank you.